In 1903, the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk. In December 1938 in Berlin, Dr. Hahn split the uranium atom. In April 1943, Dr. Estelle Karst, working under the Federal Emergency Defense Authority, perfected the Karst-Ubre technique for producing artificial radioactives. So, American foreign policy had to change. Had to. It's very difficult to tuck a bugle call back into a bugle. Pandora's box is a one-way proposition. You can turn pig into sausage, not sausage into pig. Broken eggs stay broken. All the king's horses and all the king's men can't put Humpty back together again. I ought to know. I was one of the king's men. By rights, I should not have been. I was not a professional military man when World War II broke out, and when Congress passed the draft law, I drew high numbers, high enough to keep me out of the Army long enough to die of old age. Not that very many die of old age in that generation. But I was the newly appointed secretary to a new politician. I had been his campaign manager, and my former job had left me. By profession, I was a high school teacher of economics and sociology. School boards don't like teachers of social suspects, actually to deal with social problems, and my contact was not renewed. I jumped at the chance to go to Washington. My man was named Manning. Yes, the Manning. Colonel Clyde C. Manning, U.S. Army retired Mr. Commissioner Manning. What you may not know about him is that he was one of the Army's #1 experts in chemical warfare before a leaky heart put him on the shelf. I had picked him, with the help of a group of my political associates, to run against the two-bit chiseler who was the incumbent in our district. We needed a strong liberal candidate, and Manning was tailor-made for the job. He had served one term in the grand jury, which cut his political eye teeth, and stayed active in civic matters thereafter. Being a retired Army officer was a political advantage in vote-getting among the more conservative and well-to-do citizens, and his record was okay for the other side of the fence. I'm not primarily concerned with vote-getting. What I liked about him was that, though he was liberal, he was tough-minded, which most liberals aren't. Most liberals believe that water runs downhill, but praise God it'll never reach the bottom. Manning wasn't like that. He could see a logical necessity and act on it, no matter how unpleasant it might be. After that, Manning had to tell me a lot of things he had on his mind. I'm going to try to relate them as carefully as possible, even at the risk of being dull and obvious, and of repeating things that are common knowledge. We had a weapon that could not be stopped. Any type of KO dust scattered over an area rendered that area uninhabitable for a length of time that depended on the half-life of the radioactivity. Period. Full stop. Once an area was dusted, there was nothing that could be done about it, until the radioactivity had fallen off to the point where it was no longer harmful. The dust could not be cleaned out. It was everywhere. There was no possible way to counteract it, combine it chemically. The radioactive isotope was still there, still radioactive, still deadly. Once used on a stretch of land, for an undetermined length of time, that piece of Earth would not tolerate life. It was extremely simple to use. No complicated bomb sites were needed. No care needed to hit some military objective. Take it aloft in any sort of aircraft. Attain a position more or less over the area you wish to sterilize, and drop the stuff. Those on the ground, in the contaminated area, are dead men. Dead in an hour, a day, a week, a month, depending on the degree of the infection, but dead. Manning told me that he had once seriously considered, in the middle of the night, recommending that every single person, including himself, who knew the Karst-Ubre technique, to be put to death in the interest of all civilization. But he had realized the next day that it had been a sheer funk. The technique was certain to time to rediscover by someone else. Furthermore, it would not do to wait. to refrain from using the grisly power until someone else perfected it and used it. The only possible chance to keep the world from being turned into one huge morgue was for us to open the power first, drastically get the upper hand, and keep it. We were not at war, legally, yet we had been in the war to our wrecks up to the weight, the side of the democracy since 1940. Manning had proposed to the president that we turn a supply of dust over to Great Britain, under the conditions we specified, and enable them thereby to force peace. But the terms of the peace would be dictated by the United States. We were not turning over the secret. After that, the Pax Americana. The United States was having power thrust on it willy-nilly. We had to accept it and enforce a worldwide peace ruthlessly and drastically, or would be seized by some other nation. There could be no co-equals in the possession of the weapon. The factor of time predominated. I was selected to handle the details in England because Manning insisted, and the president agreed with him, that every person technically acquainted with karst over a process should remain in the laboratory reservation in what amounted to protective custody imprisonment. That included Manning himself. I could go because I did not have the secret, could not have acquired it, without years of schooling, what I did not know. I could not tell, even underweight. We were determined to keep this secret as long as we could, to consolidate the Pax. We did not distrust our English counterparts, but they were Britishers, with a first loyalty to the British Empire. There's no need to tempt them. I was picked because I understood the background, if not the science, and because Manning trusted me. I don't know why this president trusted me too, but then my job was not complicated. I don't know what you chaps are waiting for. What the Jerrys need is a dose of their own Schlichtling, a lesson in their own Aryan culture. I shook my head. We'll have to do it our own way. Our president stipulated that the RAF was not to bomb during the period of negotiation, but their bombers were busy nevertheless. The continent was showered night after night with berries of leaflets prepared by our own propaganda agents. The first of these called on the people of the Reich to stop a useless war and promised that the terms of peace would not be vindicative. The second rain of pamphlets showed photographs, herds of steers. The third one, a simple direct warning to get out of cities and to stay out. As Manning put it, we were calling halt 3 times before firing. I don't think he or the president expected it to work, but we were morally obligated to try. While we were there, we saw the motion pictures that had been made of the death of Berlin. You haven't seen them. They never were made public, but they never were of great use at convincing the other nations of the world that peace was a good idea. I saw them when Congress did, being allowed in because I was Manning's assistant. They had been made by a pair of RAF pilots who had dodged the Luftwaffe to get them. The first shot showed some of the main streets in the morning after the raid. It was not much to see that would show up in the telescope shots, just busy and crowded streets. But if you looked closely, you could see that they had been a successive number of automobile accidents. The last sequence showed Berlin and the roads around it, weeks after the raid. The city was dead. There was not a man, a woman, a child, nor cat, nor dog, nor pigeon. Bodies were all around, but they were from rats. The roads around Berlin were quiet now, scattered carelessly on the shoulders and in ditches, and to lesser extent on the pavement itself, like coal shaken off a train, were the quiet heaps that had been the citizens of the capital of the Reich. There's no use in talking about it. The 2 pilots who made the pictures eventful died of systemic cumulative affection. Dust in the air over Berlin. With precautions, it need not have happened, but the English did not believe, as yet, that our extreme precautions were necessary. The Reich took about a week to fold up. It might have taken longer if the new Fuhrer had not gone to Berlin the day of the raid to prove that the British boasts have been hollow. There is no need to recount the provisional governments that Germany had in the following several months. The only one we are concerned with is the called restored monarchy, which used a cousin of the old Kaiser as a symbol, the one that sued for peace. Then the trouble started. The United States, and in particular, the President of the United States, was confronted with two inescapable problems. First, we had to consolidate our position at once, use our temporary advantage and overwhelming powerful weapon to ensure that such a weapon would not be turned on us. Second, some means had to be worked out to stabilize American foreign policy, that it could handle the tremendous power we had suddenly had thrust upon us. The second was by far the most difficult and serious. If we went to establish a reasonably permanent peace, say a century or so, through a monopoly on a weapon powerful that no one dare fight us, it was imperative that the policy under which we acted be more lasting than passing political administrations. But more on that later. The first problem had to be attended to at once. It was the time of the heart of it. The emergency lay in the simplicity of the weapon. It required nothing but aircraft to scatter it and dust itself, which was easily and quickly made by anyone possessing the secret of the Karlsruhe process and having access to a small supply of uranium. But the Karlsruhe process was simple and might be independently developed at any time. Manning reported to the President that it was Redpath's opinion, concurred in by Manning, that the stay of any modern radiation laboratory should be able to work out any equivalent technique in 6 weeks, working from the hint given by the events in the Berlin alone, and should then be allowed to produce enough dust to cause major destruction in another 6 weeks. 90 days. 90 days provided they started from scratch or not already halfway to their goal. Less than 90 days, perhaps no time at all. By the time Manning was an unofficial member of the cabinet, Secretary of Dust, the President called him, one of the rare jovial moods. As for me, well, I attended cabinet meetings too. As the only layman who had seen the whole show from beginning to end, the President wanted me there. I am an ordinary sort of man, who by concentration of improbabilities found himself shoved into the council of the rulers. But I found that the rulers were ordinary men too, and frequently as bewildered as I was. But Manning was no ordinary man. In him, ordinary had since raised the level of genius. Oh yes, I know that it's popular to blame everything on him. They call him everything from traitor to mad dog, but I still think he was wise and benevolent. I don't care how many second-guessing historians disagree with me. I propose, said Manning, that we begin to immobilize all aircraft throughout the world. The Secretary of Commerce raised his eyebrows. Are you sure? Being a little fantastic, Colonel Manning? No, I'm not. I'm being realistic. The key to this problem is aircraft. With aircraft, the dust is an inefficient weapon. The only way I see to gain time enough to deal with the world problem is to ground all aircraft and put them out of operation. All aircraft, that is, not actually in the service of the United States Army. After that, we can deal with complete world disarmament and permanent methods of control. Really now, you're not proposing that commercial airlines be put out of operation. They're an essential part of the world economy. Would be an intolerable nuisance. Getting killed is an intolerable nuisance too. I do propose just that. All aircraft. All. The President had been listening without comment. Now he cut in. How about aircraft on which some groups depend to stay alive, Colonel? Such as the Alaskan lines. If there are such, they must be operated by American Army pilots and crew, no exceptions. The Secretary of Commerce looked startled. I would infer That last remark that you intended this prohibition to apply to the United States, as well as other nations. Naturally. That's impossible. It's unconstitutional. It violates civil rights. Yeah, well, killing a man violates his civil rights too. You can't do it. Any federal court in the country would enjoin you in minutes. The issue is sharp, gentlemen. We might as well drag it out in the open. We can be dead men, with everything in due order, constitutional and technically corrected, or we can do what has to be done, stay alive, try to straighten out the legal aspects later. He shut up and he waited. "What do you propose?" asked the president. "I propose that we treat this as an opportunity to create a worldwide democratic commonwealth. Let's use our present dominant position is to call all nations to send representatives to a conference to form a world constitution." Nobody spoke for some minutes. You could see them turning it over in their minds, doubtful, partially approving, intrigued, but dubious. There are a lot of good, kindly people who are internationalists these days. 9 out of 10 of them are soft in the head, and the 10th is ignorant. If we set up a worldwide democracy, what will the electorate be? Take a look at the facts. 400 million Chinese with no more concept of voting and citizen responsibility than a flea. 300 million Hindus. The Eurasian Union, who believe in God, know that. The entire continent of Africa. 80 million in Asia. The Bill of Rights, the way we think of it. 250 million people, 24 different nationalities, all with revenge and black hatred in their hearts. No, it won't be washed. It's preposterous to talk about a world democracy for many years to come. If you turn the secret of the dust over to such a body, you will be arming the whole world to commit suicide. Manning stood in it, till turn came back again. Maybe I am all those things, and everyone likes to say I am. But you haven't met my arguments. What are you going to do about the hundreds of millions of people who have no experience nor love for democracy? Now perhaps I don't have the same concept of democracy as yourself, but I do know this. Out west there's a couple 100,000 people who sent me to Congress, and I'm not going to stand quietly by and let its course be allowed to follow, which I think will result in their death, their utter ruin. Here is the probable future, as I see it. Potential in the smashing of the atom and the development of lethal artificial radioactives. Some power makes a supply of the dust. They'll hit us first to try to knock us out and give them free hand. New York and Washington overnight. Then all of our industrial areas where we're all politically and economically disorganized. But our army would not be in those cities. We would have been planes and a supply of dust somewhere where the first dusting would touch them. Our boys would bravely and righteously proceed to poison their big cities. Back and forth it would go until the organization of each country broken down completely, so there was no longer a way to maintain sufficiently high levels of industrialization to service planes, manufacture dust. This presupposes starvation, plague in the process. And I suppose the rest you can fill in the details. Eventually, he convinced them all. They all came around. The president had deliberately let Manning bear the brunt of the argument, confirming his own stock of goodwill to coax the obdurate. He decided against putting it up to Congress, the dusters who had been overhead before each senator had finished his say. What he intended to do might be unconstitutional, but if he failed to act, there might not be any constitution shortly. There was the precedent, the Emancipation Proclamation, the Monroe Doctrine, Louisiana Purchase, suspension of habeas corpus in the war between the states, the Destroyer Deal. On February 22nd, the president declared a full state of emergency internally, set his peace proclamation to the head of every sovereign state. Divested of his diplomatic surplusage, it said, "The United States is prepared to defeat any power, or combinations of power in jig time. Accordingly, we are outlawing war, and are calling on every nation to disarm completely at once. In other words, throw down your guns, boys. We've got the drop on you." A supplement set forth the procedure. All aircraft capable of flying the Atlantic were to be delivered in 1 week's time to a field, or rather a great stretch of prairie, just west of Fort Riley, Kansas. For lesser aircraft, a spot near Shanghai and a rendezvous in Wales were designated. Memoranda would be issued later with respect to other war equipment. Uranium and its areas were not mentioned. That would come later. No excuses. Failure to disarm would be construed as an act of war against the United States. There was no case of apoplexy in the Senate. Why not? I don't know. There were only 3 powers to be seriously worried about: England, Japan, and the Eurasian Union. England had not been forewarned. They had all pulled her out of the war she was losing. She, or rather her men, power, they knew nothing accurately of what we could do. Japan was another matter. They had not seen Berlin. They didn't really believe it. Besides, they had been telling each other for so many years they lived that unbeatable, and they believed it. It does not do to get too tough. The negotiations were conducted very quietly indeed. But our fleet was halfway from Pearl Harbor to Kobe, loaded with enough dust to sterilize their 6 biggest cities before they were concluded. You know what did it? This never hit the newspapers, but it was the wording of the pamphlets we produced to scatter before the dusting. The Emperor was pleased to declare a new world of peace. The official version, built up from home consumption, made the whole matter one of collaboration between 2 great friends, friendly powers. And the Eurasian Union was a puzzle. And after Stalin's unexpected death in 1941, no Western nation knew very much about what went on there. Our own diplomatic relations had atrophied through failure. Men called home 4 years earlier before. Everybody knew, of course, that the new group in power called themselves the Filth Internationalists. But what they meant, aside from ceasing to display the pictures of Lenin and Stalin, nobody knew. But the Eurasian Union agreed to our terms and offered to cooperate in every way. They pointed out that the Union had been wand-like and kept out of the recent world struggle. It was fitting that the 2 remaining great powers should be used to their greatness to ensure a lasting peace. I was delighted. I had never been worried about the EU. They commenced delivery of some of the smaller parts of the planes, the receiving stations near Shanghai at once. The reports on the numbers and quality of the planes seemed to indicate that they stayed out of the way through necessity. The planes were mostly of German make and in poor condition, types that Germany had abandoned earlier in the war. Manning went west to supervise certain details and construction with the immobilization of the big planes, the transoceanic planes, which were not to gather in Fort Riley. We planned to spray them with oil, then dust from a low altitude, as in cropping dust. A lot of concentration of one-year dust. Then we could turn back our backs, forget them, while attending to other matters. But there were hazards. The dust was not allowed to reach Kansas City, Lincoln, Wichita, any of the nearby cities. The smaller towns around had been temporarily exhausted. Testing stations need to be set up in all directions in order to accurate tab on what dust might be kept. Manning felt personally responsible to make sure that no bystander was poisoned. We circled the receiving station before landing at Fort Riley. I could pick out 3 landing fields which had hurriedly been graded. Their runaways were white in the sun, the 24-hour cement as yet undeterred. Around each of the landing fields was crowded dozens of parking fields, less perfectly graded. Tractors and bulldozers were still at work on some of them. In the easternmost fields, the German and British ships were already in place, jammed wing to body as tightly as planes in the flight deck of a camp lounge. Only 3 flying fortresses had arrived from the Eurasian Union. Their representatives had asked for a short delay in order that a supply of high-test aviation gasoline might be delivered to them. They claimed a shortage of fuel necessary to make the long flight over the Arctic safe. There was no way to check the claim. The delay was granted while a shipment was routed from England. We were about to leave, Manning having satisfied himself as to safety precautions, when a dispatch came in announcing that a flight of EU bombers might be expected before their day was out. Manning wanted to see them arrive. We waited around for 4 hours. When it was finally reported that our escort of flighters had picked them up in the Canadian border, Manning appeared to have grown fidgety and stated that he would watch them from the air. We took off, gained altitude, and waited. There were 9 of them in the flight, cruising in column of echelons and looking so huge that our little fighters were hardly noticeable. They circled the field, and I was admiring the stale dignity of them when Manning's pilot, Lieutenant Rafferty, exclaimed, "What the devil? They're preparing to land downwind." I still did not tumble, but Manning shouted at the co-pilot, "Get the field!" He fiddled with the instruments and announced, "Got him, sir. General alarm. Armor." We could not hear the sirens, naturally, but I could see the white plumes rise from the big steam whistle on the roof of the administration building. 3 long blasts, 3 short ones. It seemed almost the same time the first could break from the EU planes. Instead of landing, they passed low over the receiving station, jam-packed now with ships from all over the world. Each echelon picked one of 3 groups centered around the 3 landing fields, and streamers of heavy brown smoke poured from the bellies of the EU ships. I saw a tiny black figure jump around a tractor and run toward the nearest building. Then the smoke screen obscured the field. "Do you still have the field?" "Yes, sir." "Cross-connect to the chief technician. Hurry." The co-pilot cut in the amplifier so that Manning could talk directly. "Saunders, this is Manning. How about it?" "Radioactive, Chief. Intensity 7.4. They had paralleled the Karst-Obrey research. Manning cut him off and demanded the communication office at the field raise of the Chief of Staff. There was a nerve-stretching delay, where it had to be routed over land wire to Kansas City, and some chief lines that were in commercial use. But we got through at last, and Manning made his report. It stands to reason that other flights are approaching the border right now, right this time. New York, of course, Washington, probably Detroit and Chicago as well. No way of knowing. The Chief of Staff cut off abruptly without comment. I knew that the U.S. air fleets, in a state of alert for weeks past, would have their orders in a few seconds and would be on their way to hunt out down the attackers, if possible before they could reach the cities. I glanced back at the field. The formations were broken up. One of the EU bombers was downed to crash half a mile beyond the station, while I watched one of the big Diva bombers scream down the behemoth EU ship and unloaded its eggs. It was a center hit, but the American pilot had cut it too fine, could not pull out, crashed before his victim. There's no point in rehashing the newspaper stories of the 4 Days War. The point is that we should not have lost it, and we should have. and not before an unlikely combination of luck, foresight, and good management. Apparently, the nuclear physicists of the Eurasian Union were almost as far along as Ridpath's crew when the destruction of Berlin gave the tip they needed. But we had rushed them, forced them to move before they were ready, because of the deadline for disarmament set forth in the peace proclamation. If the president had walked to the right, Congress, before issuing the proclamation, there would not be any United States. Manning never got credit for it, but it's evident to me that he anticipated the possibility of something that the 4 days war prepared for in a dozen different devious ways. I don't mean military preparations. The Army and the Navy saw to that, but it was no accident that Congress was adjourned at that time. I had something to do with the vote swapping and compromising that led up to it, and I know. But I put it to you. Would you have maneuvered to get Congress out of Washington at a time when he feared that Washington might be attacked? If he had dictatorial ambitions. Of course. It was the president who was the back of the 10-day leaves that had been granted to most of the civil service personnel in Washington, and he himself must have had the decision to take a swing through the South at that time. But it must not have been Manning who put the idea in his head. It is inconceivable that the president would have left Washington to escape a personal danger. But then, there was the plague scare. I don't know how or when Manning could have started that. It certainly did not go through all my notebooks. But I simply do not believe that it was accidental that a completely unfounded rumor of bubonic plague caused New York City to be semi-deserted at the time of the EU bombers struck. At that, we lost over 800,000 people in Manhattan alone. Of course, the government was blamed for the lives that were lost, and the papers were merciless in their criticism at the failure to anticipate and enforce an evacuation of all the major cities. If Manning anticipated trouble, why did he not ask for evacuation? Well, as I see it, for this reason. A big city will not help, never has been. Evacuated in response to a rational argument. London never was evacuated on any major scale, and we failed utterly in an attempt to force the evacuation of Berlin. The people of New York City had considered the danger of air raids since 1940 and were long since hardened to the thought. But the fear of a non-existent epidemic of plague caused the most nearly complete evacuation of a major city ever seen. And don't forget what we did in Vavitstock and Iritsvuk, Moscow. Those innocent people too. War isn't pretty. I said luck played a part. It was a bad navigation that caused one of our ships to dust Ryazan instead of Moscow. But that make mistakes, knocked down the laboratory and plant which produced the only supply of military radioactives in the Eurasian Union. Suppose the mistake had been the other way around. Suppose that one of the EU ships attacking Washington, D.C. by mistake had included Ridpath's shop 45 miles away in Maryland. Congress reconvened at the temporary capital in St. Louis, and the American Pacific Expedition started the job of pulling the fangs of the Eurasian Union. It was not a military operation in the usual sense. There were two simple objectives: to search out and dust all the aircraft plants and fields, and to locate and dust radiation laboratories, uranium supplies, and loads of cardotite, pitchblende. No attempt was made to interfere with or to replace civil government. We used a 2-year dust, which gave a breathing spell in which to consolidate our position. Liberal rewards were offered to informers, a technique which worked remarkably well not only in the EU, but in most parts of the world. The weasel, an instrument to smell out radiation based on the electroscope discharge principle, and refined of Ridpath's staff, greatly facilitated the work of locating uranium and uranium ores. A grizz of weasels, properly spaced over a suspect area, could locate any important mass of uranium almost as handedly as a direction finder can spot a radio station. But, notwithstanding the excellent work of General Bullfinch and the pacification expedition as a whole, It was the original mistake of dusting Riazan that made the job possible of accomplishment. Anyone interested in the details of the pacification work done in 45 and 46 should see the proceedings of American Foundation for Social Research for a paper entitled A Study of the Execution of the American Peace Policy from February 1945. The de facto solution of the problem of policing the world against the war left the United States with the great problem of perfecting a policy that would ensure that the deadly powers of the dust would never fall into unfit hands. The problem is as easy to state as the problem of squaring the circle, almost as impossible to accomplish. Both Manning and the President believe that the United States must of necessity keep the power of the time being until some permanent institution could be developed to retain it. The hazard was this: foreign policy is lodged jointly in the hands of the President and the Congress. We were fortunate at the time in having a good President and an adequate Congress, but that was no guarantee for the future. We had unfit presidents and power-hungry Congress, oh yes. Read the history. We were about to hand over to future governments of the United States the power to turn the entire globe into an empire, our empire. And it was the sober opinion of the President that our characteristic and beloved democratic culture would not stand up under the temptation. Imperialism degrades both oppressor and oppressed. The President was determined that our sudden power should be used for absolute minimum of maintaining peace in the world. The simple purpose of outlawing war and nothing else. It must not be used to protect American investments abroad, to coerce trade agreements for any purpose but the simple abolition of mass killing. There is no science of sociology. Perhaps there will be someday. A rigorous physician gives the finished science of colloidal chemistry that leads to turn to a complete knowledge of biology. There's a definitive psychology. After that, we may begin to know something about sociology and politics, sometime around the year 5000 AD. Maybe if the human race does not commit suicide before then. But until then, there's only a horse sense, rule of thumb, and observational knowledge of probabilities. Manning and the President play by ear. The treaties with Great Britain, Germany, and the Eurasian Union, whereby we assume the responsibilities for world peace and at the same time guaranteed the contracting nations against our own misuse of power, were rushed through the period of relief and goodwill that immediately followed the termination of the 4 Days' War. We followed the precedents established by the Panama Canal Treaties, the Suez Canal Agreements, and the Philippine Independence Policy. But the purpose and underneath was to commit future governments of the United States to an irrevocable, benevolent policy. The act to implement the treaties by creating the Commission of World Safety followed soon after, and Colonel Manning became Mr. Commissioner Manning. Commissioners had a life tenure, and the intention was to create a body with the integrity, permanence, and freedom from outside pressure, possessed by the Supreme Court of the United States. Since the treaties contemplated an eventful joint trust, commissioners need not be American citizens, and the oath they took not preserve the peace of the world. There was no trouble getting to the clause past the Congress. Every other similar oath had been the Constitution of the United States. Nevertheless, the Commission was formed. It took charge of world aircraft, assumed jurisdiction over radioactives, natural and artificial, and commenced the long, slow task of building up the Peace Patrol. Manning envisioned a corps of world policemen, an aristocracy which, through selection and indoctrination, could be trusted with unlimited power of the life of every man, every woman, every child on the face of the globe. For the power would be unlimited, the precautions necessary to ensure the unbeatable weapon of getting loose in the world again made it axiomatic that its custodians would wield power that is safe only in the hands of a deity. There would be no guard to guard those self-same guardians. Their own characters and the watch they kept on each other would be all that stood between the race and disaster. For the first time in history, Supreme political power was not to be exerted with no possibility of checks and balances from outside. Manning took up the task of perfecting it with dragging subconscious conviction. It was too much for human nature. The rest of the commission was appointed slowly, the names being sent to the Senate after long joint consideration by the President and Manning. The director of the Red Cross, an obscure little professor of history from Switzerland, Dr. Igor Rimsky, who had developed the Karl-Stobre technique independently and whom the APF had discovered in prison after the dusting of Moscow. Those were three long foreigners. The rest of the list is unknown. Redpath and his staff were of necessity the original technical crew of the commission. The United States Army and Navy pilots, its first patrolmen. Not all of the pilots available were needed. Their records were searched, their habits and associates investigated, their mental processes and emotional attitudes examined by the best psychological research methods available, which were good enough. The final acceptance of the patrol depended on two personal interviews, one with Manning, one with the President. Manning told me that he depended more on the President's feeling for my character than he did on the association and reaction tests from psychologists could think up. It's like the nose of a bloodhound. In 40 years of political practice, he's seen more phonies than you and I will ever see, and each one was trying to sell him something. He can tell one in the dark. The long-distance plan included the schools for the indoctrination of cadet patrolmen, schools that were to be open to use for any race, color, or nationality, and from which they could go forth and guard the peace of every country but their own. To that country, a man would never return through his service. They were to be deliberately expatriated, a band of Jazzarians, an obligation only to the commission and to the race, and welded together with a carefully nurtured esprit de corps. It stood a chance of working. Had Manning been allowed to work 20 years without interruption, the original plan might have worked. February 17th, 1951. I missed the teleview flash and the plane crash that killed the President because I was lying down in my apartment. Manning by that time was requiring me to rest every afternoon after lunch, though I was still on duty. I first heard about it from my secretary when I returned to my office, and at once hurried into Manning's office. There was a curious unreality to that meeting. It seemed to me that we had slipped back to that day when I returned from England, the day that Estelle Karst died. He looked up. "Hello, John," he said. I put my hand on his shoulders. "Don't take it too hard, Chief." That was all I could think to say. 48 hours later came the message from the newly sworn-in president for Manning to report to him. I took it into him, an official dispatch, which I decoded. Manning read it, face impassive. "Are you going, Chief?" Why, certainly. I went back into my office and got my topcoat, gloves, and briefcase. Manning looked up when I came in. "Never mind, John. You're not going." I guess I must have looked stubborn, he added. "You're not going to go. There's work here to do. Wait just here a minute." He went to his safe, twiddled the dials, opened it, removed a seated envelope. He threw at the desk between us. "Here are your orders. Get busy." He went out, and I was opening them. I read them through, and I got busy. There was enough time. The new president received Manning, standing and in company of several of the bodyguards and inmates. Manning recognized the senator, who led the moment to use the patrol to recover expropriated holdings in South America and Rhodesia, as well as the chairman of the Committee of the Aviation, with whom he had several unsatisfactory conferences in an attempt to work out a modus operandi for reinstituting commercial airlines. There were incidents thereafter, such as unfortunate affair from Fort Benning 3 days later, and the stubborn outbreak in the wing of the patrol based in Lisbon, and its resultant wholesale dismissal. For practical purposes, it was all there was to the coup d'etat. Manning, at that point, was the undisputed military dictator of the world. Whether or not any man or universally hated as Manning can perfect the patrol he envisioned, make it self-perpetuating and trustworthy, I don't know. Because of that week of waiting in buried English hangars, it won't be hard to find out. Manning's heart disease makes the outcome even more uncertain. He may last another 20 years. He may keel over dead tomorrow. Land. There's no one to take his place. I said this down partly to occupy the short time I have left, and partly to show there's another side to any story, even world dominion. Not that I would like the outcome either way. If there is anything to be survived after this death business, I'm going to look up the man who invented the bow and arrow, take him apart with his bare hands. For myself, I can't be happy in a world where any man or a group of men has the power of death over you, me, our neighbors, every human, every animal, every living thing. I don't think anyone